All right, we're on day 6 of the 2024 Olympic Games, and already I've been thoroughly enjoying the Games. There's just so many sports to watch that many of us don't normally take the time out to watch. But if you have watched the Games over the years, you may have noticed the inclusion of newer Olympic sports from time to time. And this year, a new sport was introduced to the Games, and 3 other sports are appearing for just the second time in the Summer Olympics. I've always wondered how a sport is chosen for the Olympic Games, who determines who makes the cut, and why. We're going to talk about this. We're going to do it with a sports journalist who recently broke it all down. Her name is Kavitha Davidson, and she explains it all on a recent episode of her podcast, Sportly. And now we're going to discuss it more with Kavitha, who joins me now. Kavitha, how you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me on, Dexter.
Always good to talk to you, Kavitha. So, Kavitha, I found your recent podcast fascinating because it answered a lot of questions that I had about the Olympics. So let's start with the process of inclusions for different sports. What are the primary criteria that the International Olympic Committee uses to determine whether a sport is included in the Olympics, and how do these criteria reflect the evolving nature of sport globally?
Yeah, so it's actually very complicated, as you can imagine. The IOC in their Olympic charter lays out 35 total criteria that a potential host city has to meet, and that a potential host city's Olympic program has to meet. That falls under 5 themes, and so we won't go over all of them now, of course, but some of the major ones are, first of all, a sport has to have an international federation, meaning it has to have a global governing body. It has to have an arm of that governing body has to oversee the World Anti-Doping Agency code compliance, that kind of thing. And then there's some other criteria that have to do with kind of what the Olympics themselves get out of that sports inclusion. So popularity is obviously a big one. Global popularity is one as well, both for men and women. There's a certain number of countries that have to participate in the sport across a certain number of continents. And there does have to be also a women's governing body as well, because now the IOC requires that men and women have to have equal potential participation in new sports. Value added to the Olympic movement is a really interesting one to me. 2 of those criteria break down to how it adds to the legacy of the Olympic Games. But the other one is youth. And I think that that's super interesting when we see the sports that are being added as other games go on. And then the other thing I'll say is that starting with the Tokyo Games in what should have been 2020, but really 2021, the IOC started this practice of allowing host cities to propose temporary sports that would be included just for that year's Olympics. So these would be sports usually that are super popular in the host city. So for Tokyo, we saw, for example, baseball was brought back, and we will see baseball brought back in LA because obviously it's, you know, the America's pastime. But that speaks to how the Olympics are really trying to gain momentum for their own games based on what the host city's needs and locations are.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating with the fact that we know baseball has come back. Now it'll be there also for 2028 games. We'll also see softball. That'll be interesting, too, just seeing how the host cities have sports that are probably a little bit more native to their area, but also have some global appeal as well. I got to ask this, Kavitha, how have newer Olympic sports like climbing, skateboarding, or surfing introduced during the Tokyo Games in 2021 fared in terms of global popularity and athlete participation since their inclusion?
It's actually really interesting. A sport like skateboarding, which was already super popular among very young people, it had the youngest Olympians in Tokyo. We had 13-year-olds going for medals, which was wild to see. But if you talk to the athletes, you know, across not just skateboarding, but skateboarding is a really good example. If you talk to the athletes themselves, they say that they have seen participation grow. They also say that their sports are taken a lot more seriously, particularly in sports like surfing and skateboarding that were seen as kind of more of like a niche kind of subcultural pastime and not so much an organized sport. You know, they say that they're respected more as athletes. And in addition to increased participation, a lot of these athletes also say that they've seen a lot more interest from women in their sport. So there's been a lot more gender parity that's been brought on. And that's interesting to see because we don't see that with some of the more established Olympic sports. There's actually been a lot of reporting in the last 4 to 5 years about how Olympic sports on the collegiate level in the States are actually seeing a lot of decline because the NCAA is cutting sports and schools are cutting sports due to budget cuts. So it's interesting to see how the newer sports are absolutely benefiting from inclusion in the Olympic program, while some of the older sports could use a little bit of a lifeline.
Yeah, very interesting to see, and we'll see how that changes or improves going forward. Now, got to ask you this, because as New Yorkers, the Summer Games' newest sport is very familiar to us, right? Breaking, or as many people know it, breakdancing, is a new sport in the 2024 Olympics. What challenges and opportunities does this dance sport, if you want to call it that, face in its Olympic debut?
Yeah, so I'm going to inject here a shameless plug that our next episode of Sportly is all about breaking, about the history, about the hip hop origins from the South Bronx of breaking, and then about some of the controversy here. So absolutely tune into that. But to kind of break it all down a little bit here, it's really interesting when you look at a sport like breaking that is an art form, but also a form of cultural expression, right? And several years ago when breaking was added to the Olympic program, when it was announced that it was added to the Olympic program, I interviewed Rockefeller and Crazy Legs from the Rocksteady crew, the legendary Rocksteady crew, of course. And the attitudes about inclusion in the Olympic program really do vary wildly. There are a lot of people who say, again, this legitimizes what we've been doing for many years. There are a lot of people who say this brings more attention. This obviously brings a whole lot more money to the sport, to the art form, to the sport. But then there are many people, and I understand where they're coming from, that say this commercializes something that was supposed to be a form of self-expression that were really born out of marginalized communities in the South Bronx. And now it's this global thing that, Red Bull sponsors these giant tournaments around the globe. And there's a lot of kind of controversy about that. Now, the other question that I had, and one of the things that I actually was talking to with one of the B girls, Sunny Choi, who's on the Team USA's team this year, was how exactly do you score? How do you judge something that is as subjective as a dance form, as an art form? And we've obviously had some of these issues come up in other sports, like figure skating, for example, right? But it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out on Olympic stage.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I'm very intrigued to watch how that all plays out. And then also what happens next with breaking, as you're discussing how people feel about it in the culture. How is that viewed as a sport going forward? And does it stay in the Olympics? That's definitely one to watch. But there's always this discussion among even sports fans as to what should or should not be in Olympic sports. So I'm going to ask you this question. If the Olympics are not considered the height of competition in a particular sport, for example, like basketball, tennis, or golf, should it still be included in the games? And what are the arguments for and against this?
Yeah, I'll actually admit to you here that my whole impetus for doing this episode was because I'm salty that baseball and softball are not permanent parts of the Olympic program. I love, they're my favorite sports. And the reasoning there is, as you said, for many years, Major League Baseball was not sending its pros. So you had college players and other amateurs in the Olympics. You did not have the highest level of talent. Now, obviously, that has, there isn't an amateur code anymore in the Olympics. Obviously, NBA players are competing, professional tennis stars, as you mentioned, but they're still not, as you said, the Olympics are not the marquee event, right? I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who's a swimmer yesterday, actually, and I was like, if you asked any WNBA player, any NBA player on Team USA, if they would trade a championship in their league for an Olympic gold medal, I think that almost every one of them would take the championship in their league, right? But that being said, there are many players that, probably don't get a ton of minutes in the leagues that they play in, who might get an opportunity to compete in the Olympics. And I do think that there is something to be said about, especially if you see some of the NBA players who are on the tail ends of their career, right? This is Steph Curry's first Olympic Games. This is LeBron's first since 2012. You see that for players who have kind of accomplished everything in their professional part of the sport, the Olympics might be kind of the last hurrah. And I think that that's super interesting. From the fan perspective, though, it's not the high, if it's not the height of what we consider to be, that sports grand slam or marquee event, it still is extremely high levels of competition, and the international aspect makes it super fun. And I think about, in basketball in particular, you see players who are teammates who are suddenly on different teams, and the kinds of interesting rivalries that can create. So yeah. I do think that there's still value there.
Yeah, I do too, and I do find it interesting in basketball, especially as the world has gotten better at that sport, that it's very competitive, much more than it was back in '92, right, with the Dream Team and that thing of the nature. But some people are going to have different views on what should be a sport and what should be considered that in terms of the Olympics. In your view, Kavitha, has the inclusion of newer sports in the Olympics successfully increased visibility and investment in these sports, at least at the grassroots level?
I think it has, honestly. Like I said, a lot of athletes in the smaller sports that are newer have said that they see better participation, even with something like climbing, even if we're not necessarily, and I actually don't know the numbers on climbing, so I don't take my word for it, but even if we don't see, a boom in athlete participation there, the number of climbing gyms has absolutely risen since inclusion in the Olympics. The visibility of this as a thing that people can do as an activity has risen, so you see that. But I think we also have to remember that the sports that are included or introduced in the Olympic program, they really are, they act in it as a two-way street. The IOC is looking for sports that boost the Olympics popularity and that help the Olympics gain staying power, particularly among younger generations, hence the emphasis on popularity among the youth. So, it really is kind of a give and take between the sport itself that is looking to grow and the Olympics that are looking to kind of maintain relevancy.
It's all very fascinating. We'll see how sports always evolve, society evolves. We'll see how it changes moving forward. That is Kavitha Davidson. Check out her podcast, Sportly. The latest episode is titled The Game-Changing Evolution of Olympic Sports. Really good episode. Check that out. And as you said, Kavitha, next week, talking about breaking on your podcast. That should be a fun one. Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dex.